This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. We are in Bartlesville in May 1972. I'm visiting with Mr. Stanley Kazmierzak, and I'm going to spell the last name Kazmierzak. With a name of that sort, he obviously is of Polish origin, and as a member of the Historical Society and a man of Polish origin, Mr. Kazmierzak, I hope I'm pronouncing it somewhere near right, is interested in the Polish history in this area, and that's the part that we will talk with him about, the Polish history in the Washington County area. To begin with, Mr. Kazmierzak, why don't you tell us where you were born and who your parents were and how they happened to come here?
My father immigrated or came from Poland, Warsaw, Poland, in 1896, and he got his citizenship papers in Girard, Kansas, 1898. He came to Pittsburgh, Kansas. He had an oldest sister that lived here and knew the area and the work and everything that was in the surrounding area. So she sent them passports from over there for my father and my grandfather. If you know, Poland has tried to get started many times in many ways. It was always conquered by the bigger nations. And the area where my father and grandfather lived was under German control. My father went to school over there. Being a conquered country, though, they taught German 4 days a week and 1 day in his native tongue. Then my grandfather was in 3 wars, 1864, 1866, 1870. 1864, it was with Denmark, I think it was. And then 1866, it was with another country over there. In 1870, in the war with France. And my grandfather said, if I can help it, I'm not going to let my son, Joe Kazmierzak, who was my father, not to go through the wars that he did. And my father was not of age yet to be taken in the army by the Germans. So my grandfather and dad came to Pittsburgh, Kansas. And later on, they saved enough money, and they brought the rest of the family to this country. And my father was a zinc smelter worker most all his years. There were 5 children. There were 5 girls in the family and 2 sons. And we were all born in this country. Myself, I was born in Iola. My oldest sister and brother was born in Iola. The others were born here in Oklahoma. My father lived to be 86 years of age. Mother lived to be 70 years of age. They were both in good health. Now, a little about my mother. My mother was, she talked the German language. She was born in Austria-Hungary. It's strange. In her lifetime, her country changed 3 times. I still correspond with a sister who is my aunt, or a sister of my mother. Still correspond with her, and of course she gives me all the information she's able to give. Now the country the name of the town where my mother came from was called Marine Austria-Hungary. World War I broke it up. Then it became Czechoslovakia, and the name of the town was changed from Marine Austria-Hungary to Spišská Stolica, Czechoslovakia. Then, now you know, of recent date, Czechoslovakia was conquered by the Russians, and her address now is C-123 CSR, meaning Czechoslovakia, Russia. Then all my relatives on the mother's side they talked the German language, and I can always remember, since I told you previously that my father come from a conquered country, Poland, and they taught 4 days German and 1 day Polish. Well, my mother's language was German, and I can always remember when I was a child, my grandfather in town went among my dad's folks. They always pulled me or did something to me, wanted me to continue talking the Polish language. And my mother and dad, by the way, were married 40 years ago, May 9th, 1900. They were married in Iola, Kansas. And from the family were 5 girls and 2 boys. Then later, my mother's parents, in early years, they did come to this country. They lived in Pueblo, Colorado for 9 years, but they went back to Austria-Hungary, which was known at that time. And that is about all I can tell you right now.
Were there many, you've made quite a study of the Polish ethnic group in this area. Is there an unusual number of Polish people in Washington County area?
Now, back that time, they released 600 families here, but now I would say there's at least 30, 40 families here now, still live here.
Many less than there were.
You're right. There are not many here anymore.
Why did they come to Washington County?
Well, I'll tell you, the Smelders were in boom back that time. They were getting started back early 1900, and there was plenty of work here to do, so they sent scouts. There were 3 Smelders here getting organized and getting started, the Bartlesville Zinc, the National Zinc, and the Atlantean Star. And these scouts were sent all over the United States, I guess, to get people to work here with the Smelders. And that's why my father came here, and all these other Poles were. And then they came in here from New Jersey, St. Louis, and you just name the towns. They just came in here from everywhere. That's how come they come to this part of the country.
Who were some of the prominent early Polish people in this area?
Well, we had a teacher here, Frank Balser. He taught here in the high school, and he was back here recently. In fact, I have a little history about him, if you care to me tell you anything about him. I'll tell you something about him. And here is the information I received from Ida Allen as a retired school teacher over at Dewey. She gave me this information. Frank Balser was educated at Tulsa University and Oklahoma University. He was a history and coach instructor at Bartlesville High School, 1919 and 20. Then he went to Dewey for teaching in years 1920, 21, and 22. He left Dewey for Detroit, Michigan, where he taught and coached. He was considered a good athlete. From Detroit, Frank left for Poland for a commission as an officer in the Polish Army. After serving his enlistment, he was back in Detroit to teach again. In 1960, he was back in Dewey and Bartlesville to visit his old friends. He's still living in Detroit.
Thinking about some that you know and some who remained in Oklahoma and who gained some prominence either locally or statewide, who would you think of? Who would you stigmatize? Rather than read their things, let's talk about people you know.
Okay. Well, we've got a Stanley Orlusky. He's an engineer with Phillips Petroleum Company. He's been with the company 25 years or better, and he lives northeast of Dewey. He's got quite an acreage. He sidelined his cattle and his farming, and then he has several children. They're all graduates of Oklahoma State University, as well as his wife.
Do you have any, or did you in the past, were there any Polish special social events? You know, in many areas where there are ethnic groups, they'll have annual festivals like at Prague and such. Did you have any Polish festivals here, either now or in the past?
Yes, there were many here. For example, in weddings, you take a wedding, that was a big event, and usually some of those weddings lasted 3 days. In other words, most of them all usually had to come during evening to dance and other entertainments they had for them. It was a big event when they were married. And then church events, of course, most of all the people were Catholics, if you know. And whenever any of them were baptized, too, they had big dinners or celebrations or confirmed or you name it. There were many of those kind of entertainments around here by these people.
Did you have any Polish events here that attracted people from other areas like the Prague festival that they have?
Not that I know of, but Mr. Sark, he's a local man here, has many clippings and many articles about them. There were many Polish boys that played in our local Smelter band years ago, and there were big events here of that type here, but none as big as Prague.
Ron, you want to take over a second on the change of the team? We're talking basically about the Polish group.
Okay, I'm pretty. You asked me about police settlements around here. Yes, there were several. There was southwest of the Smelters and south of the Smelters. The one south of Smelters was called Smelter Town, and Skeeter Row was out below the mound, which is out west of town. And then there was Frog Holler. That was in the Smelter area. There was about 5 of those settlements, and you couldn't name one that wasn't police people that lived there. Practically all those homes are gone. Very few are left around here anymore.
But there are a good many Poles still living in
Oh, yes, there's quite a few. For example, I'll just give you a list of some of them that are here now. There's Orlowskis. There are the Meeknos. There are the Turoskis. And there are the Hermillas. There are the Novaks, the Cetics. And I could name you several others, too. And, of course, we had our casualty, too, among our soldier boys in different wars. For example, here's some that were killed in action during World War I. We had Anton Tuskevich, and we had a William Yosik. In World War II, we had a Louis Hermilla, and we had a Tom Novak, and we have a Frank Cetic. And Vietnam names, I haven't been able to get some, but I'm sure there's some Polish boys in the casualties, too, of the wars that we've had.
Are Polish people ethnically closely related to the Czechs?
Well, I'll tell you, myself, I'm not fluent in the language, but I don't think anybody could sell me because I could understand certain things. And I used to have to talk with my hands, or I'll bring out some words, and of course there'll be American words in there too. And these people that have lived here in the past, there were some wonderful people, all right. And there's many of them still live here. Like you mentioned, asked the names, I gave you a few of them. Of course, there are grandchildren, and some of their children are here now, and they're still living here. Some work for Phillips, some live in doctor's office here, and they're scattered. Some work at Smelters. They're the past generation, future generation.
If somebody says "Dobryano" to you,
that would be Dobrano means good morning to me.
That's right. That's what it is in Czech.
Yeah, well, that's so. See, you answered the question about Czech. I've gone to this event in Czech, eat there. Oh, what they're noted for down there, goulashes or something down there. I go down there and I hear them talking, and there's quite a bit of that I can understand. Yes, yeah, there's quite a bit. Yes, I enjoy going to that celebration, but we've never had anything big like that event because it's known all over, because their children are scattered all over the country, and then they and their grandchildren all come to Prague every year. It's unfortunate we didn't have something like that years ago, early 1900s, when all the Polish people were here.
Yeah.
I don't even have anything else.
This is Roland Kearns interviewing Mr. Bernard I. McClune at Bartlesville, Oklahoma on May 10th, 1972. Mr. McClune is a longtime resident of Oklahoma, and I believe he came to Bartlesville or close to Bartlesville about 1908. Is this correct, Mr. McClune?
That is correct. I landed at Copan, Oklahoma, and I got a job with the Barnesville Oil Company pumping. And I pumped a lease a mile east of the stockyard with steam in 1907, or 1908, I should say. And I later went to Roustaboutting, and we put in a lot of our time laying gas lines and water lines, hooking up wells to central powers, and things of that sort. At that time, for 4 men, a mile of 2-inch pipe was a day's work, and we laid a many a mile of it because we had a lot of gas wells that were set and shut in, and whenever a drilling rig was started, why, we went out and laid a gas line to furnish some fuel and recover a little of the money that well cost. In gas. Production methods haven't changed too much up until 1920. After 1920, the Hughes rock bit was developed and rotary commenced to be a thing of the that could be used in this area. Prior to that time, why, the old fishtail bit wouldn't drill sand and hard limestone, and after the Hughes rock bit was developed, why, they were able to drill with rotary all the way. There was a few combination rigs running, and steam was used, going back to steam was used up until 1918. We had a lease right east of Bartlesville here on lot 33. Those lots were half a mile wide and 3 miles long, and we had production on lot 33, and we pumped all but our flowing wells with steam on that lease at that time. On the east end of lot 33, we had a boiler house and 4 wells hooked up on that with steam. We used
Mr. McClune, I believe you told me that you came to work in 1908, and I believe previously you said that you were 80 years old. That'd make you going to work about 16, wouldn't it?
I was 16.
You've had, and you said you just retired here about 8 yeyears ago, is it 12 years ago? Well, you've had quite a little, and all that time in oil.
All that time in the oil field, well, I drove Stapleton number 1 in at El Dorado. I was superintendent of Stapleton, El Dorado field of the shallow stuff. And they drilled that well too deep, and I plugged the water back in that well. That's in Kansas. I plugged the water back in that well, and later had all of the drilling at that time. We didn't have any pipelines, and I had 30-star machines and 9-string standard tools running.
What was the name of the company you worked for first, and where was the lease located?
Companies I worked for was a group of companies under one management. In the early day, there was a law passed that only one person could hold a certain amount of acreage, and we had a lot of companies. I worked for the Midland Oil Company, the Midland Oil and Gas, the Puritan Oil Company, the Pilgrim Oil Company, the Sedgwick Oil Company, the Sedgwick Oil and Gas, and the 59 Osage and 59 Osage and DeGolier, and Squirrel Oil Company, and we used to get our checks. If we'd work an hour or two on a lease, well, we'd get paid for that hour, and we always had the end of the month figured up. We got $75 a month for roustaboutting, and at the end of that month, we always had to figure our checks up to see if we'd got all of our money. And it was later, the Midland companies, as they were called at that time, were sold to a Dutch syndicate. I first worked for Homer Preston, and he later left the company and went and formed the Warren Oil Company at Tulsa. And then Herbert R. Strait came, and I worked for him as long as he was here. The power came into, Central Power was developed in the east, but it didn't get to Oklahoma, only a few powers that were shipped out here from other areas. And right here in Bartlesville, Hal Durnell invented and put out the first under-eccentric band wheel power that was successful. And my father helped him develop that. My father was a power builder and a rig builder in Ohio, and he helped him develop that when he some of the things that problems that he had. The old powers, rod lines came out high and were hard to hang off the wells and were dangerous in a way. I know one fellow that had a mascot power that got caught when he was hanging a well off, and he couldn't reach the hang-off hook and bring it back up, and he was going back and forth with his finger hung in that hang-off, and he had to take his pocket knife and cut his finger off in order to get out. And the under-eccentric powers put the rod lines much lower to the ground. They also enabled them to put on automatics to take care of the pumping time. These automatics were, when the rod line dipped, why, they would miss, and when the well pumped off and the rod line run straight, why, they would hang the well off automatically. Shooting was all done with the drilling in of the wells, and the shooting was all done with nitroglycerin. And it was not only dangerous, but I can recall a few narrow escapes. On Lot 33 out here, just west of Bartlesville, where the radar station is now, we was shooting number 23 up there, and the next to the last shell didn't go down to bottom where it was supposed to go, and the shooter went out and bolted sawed off a 1x6 and bolted it onto the dart of the baler and run the baler down, and when the baler was pulled out, the ears of that shell had crimped into that 2x6, and the shell came out with it, loaded with 20 quarts of glycerin. And there was 5 of us on the derrick floor. The shooter took his awl and put another bale in that there and got it on his hook again, and we escaped that. I was also at one well where the shooter was letting the shells down too fast, and that was on the no-water road out here, and the shooter was letting the shells down too fast, and one of them went off. And we had a Star machine on as a drilling rig, and it just looked like there was a bunch of guy lines up in the air, and we all started to run. And it was muddy that day, and they had to carry the shot in, and the shooter had piled up a bunch of empties out there, and when I stopped, I was alongside of that pile of empties. We drilled Oglesby down there. We put in 80 quarts. Those were combination wells at Oglesby, and we put in 20 quart or 80 quart shots, and we couldn't pull the casing on one well, and so we loaded it as near as we could to the top and put it off anyway, and the 110 feet of pipe that we had in the hole went up higher than the mast and came down and sheared one guy line off and buried itself until we had to put up a single block to pull that there one joint out of the ground. And also at Oglesby, we drilled that in wet weather, and we had to carry a lot of the shots in from the road. The shooting wagon couldn't get in there, and we had to carry a lot of the shots from the road. And one time we was carrying a shot in, and the shooter tripped over a rod line and fell down with a couple of cans, 5 quarts apiece. Since that time, though, gel has been or solidified, or gel glycerin has been made, which made it a lot safer. And later than that yet, I held a shooting license during World War II, and we used 90% dynamite to shoot our wells. Now, all of the wells are being completed with frac. They have 2 types of frac, water frac and oil frac, and we put as much as 200 barrels of water in a well with 2 tons of sand in about 20 minutes. It takes all the way up to 4,000 pounds pressure to break down a well, but then after it's broke down, well, it just goes in there fine. We drilled a well down at Stroud, and the shooter said he'd drink all the oil, or not the shooter, but the geologist said that he'd drink all the oil that well made. And we gave it a 200-barrel water frac and 2 tons of sand. It didn't start flowing back. We had to put it to pumping, but it started off at 70 barrel a day, and no sign of any sand at all. We tubed it right to bottom. The sand they use is a type of glass sand. It's round and want mat together like most sand does. Drilling, as I said once before, it didn't change much until after the 20s. After the 20s, why, they have increased drilling to the point where the old cable tools, as we call them, that's the ones that use rope, are no more. I doubt whether you could find a rope driller in this area anymore. The swivel socket, it was invented, and it permitted them to use wire line on drilling tools. They came out along about the 20s, and drillers commenced to use wire all the way, even spudding in with wire. I have worked on tools where they spudded in with wire. The tools have increased in weight and size and length. You take an 8-inch bit now, it will be pretty near as long as I am tall up to my shoulders, which would be about 5.5 feet or 6 foot. And they weigh about 1,875 pounds apiece. The old bits that I knew as a boy were mere paddles compared to the bits that they use now. We used to get gas right under the grassroots pretty near over in the Osage there. I worked on tools in the Osage there during World War I, and all the way from Hewins, Kansas down to Winona, Oklahoma. And we we started a 12 and a half, or a 15-inch hole and put in 12 and a half to start with, and then tapered it off and finished up to about 2200 with 6 5/8. I worked on one well 600 feet in the lime right at the Clear Creek Bridge in Pawhuska. I'll have to. In pumping wells, the old way of pumping them was a cup and a working barrel, and 2-inch tubing, and iron rods. But the first successful sand, they wouldn't handle sand, and the first successful sand pump was developed here in Bartlesville by the Bell Pump Company, and they would handle quite a lot of sand. And then Hopkins and DeVold, they invented the ideal barrel, which was a much better barrel in a lot of ways than the Bell barrel was. But the Bell sued them and got a judgment against them, and they had to quit making it. And there's one thing you couldn't sand up ideal barrel where a Bell barrel would if it got the outside part sanded up. Then on pumps, there's been a lot of changes in pumps along through the different ways. First, the metal-to-metal pump, that's were developed, and then the submersible pump came along, which was a redo, and that was developed right here in Bartlesville. And then the small insert pumps were developed, and that permitted the small production well to pump longer and produce more oil. And but the redo pump is marvelous in the amount of fluid it will handle and will pump. They've used mostly around this country here. We never had any wells big enough here to warrant buying one of them. But when the water flood came along, our water supply wells were all equipped with reeders. There's 2 or 3 different secondary recovery methods back through the years. The first vacuum plant was first, and the first vacuum plant that I put in was on the Secondine lease in the Delaware Extension, and it was a cylinder made over here at the Union Machine Company, put on a steam engine and run off of an extension shaft on the power. And the power run all the time, and the belt off of that extension shaft came back and drove the vacuum pump. That was a pilot flood over there, and they later put in a Bessemer engine and an Ingersoll Rand pump. The next was air repressuring. Air repressuring didn't do too good in here. We've had several pilots running, and none of them did too good here. But up in Kansas, on some production I had in Kansas, they bought that lease, and with air repressuring and gas repressuring, finally they started with air and finally converted it to bought gas and converted it to gas repressing and recycled the gas, and that produced more oil under air repressuring than it did on the initial production to the fellow that sold it. They produced more oil than he had up until the time they bought it. And later we water flooded it and done the same thing on water flood. The old Weber pool was the first pool I pumped in, as I remembered, and we only had a small pipeline that ran up through the Weber pool, and on that lease a mile east of the stockyards there, I expect that there was as much oil went down the creek as we produced, because they were developing the shallow stuff up at one and wayside up above there, and it was vacuum system where we were, and on up there they had steam donkey pumps, and them fellows would screw the pop down on the boiler until it would carry about 125 to 130 pounds of steam, and they'd shut our vacuum off in a hurry. We had some production in the Weber pool. We had one lease that we sold oil for the donkey engine that hauled rock into the Dewey Portland, and that got rid of some oil that we couldn't get rid of otherwise. Bartlesville never had what you'd call an oil field boom like some of the other towns had. Some of the places it got pretty rough, but it never got that way in Bartlesville. It might be interesting to know that at one time I looked after 30-star machines and 9 string of standard tools, and now it takes 3 or 4 engineers and a whole office force to look after one well. There was 6 of us men followed 9 string of stools one summer up there at Dewey, and we installed the rod lines and set the jacks and laid the lead lines, maybe a mile of pipe and half a mile to a mile of gas line for every well that we drilled. There's several pools around the country, but I expect that I know the Weber pool was one of the biggest around here, and then the production west of Dewey, well, from Bartlesville clean up through to pretty near the Kansas line, was all good production all the way up through there. And some of it had 2 or 3 sands. At one time, the Cascan Oil Company, or Cascan Gas Company, had a compressor station at Wayside, Oklahoma, up there, and they was developing the Oswego lime. And one problem with the Oswego lime is they'd come in big, and in a little while they was on water. And that Cascan plant only run about 2 or 3 years. That's all I got, I guess.
Well, Mr. McClune, this has been a most interesting discussion, and it's quite apparent that you have experienced over half a century in the oil operation. But before I close this off, I want to ask you just one question that's always intrigued me for every man that has worked in oil. During your entire career, did you ever invest in or make any money in oil?
No, I never did. No, I left that for the other fella. I made good money all my life, but as far as investing, I never did. I've got some
That's incorrect, yes. Well, this is the answer that I get from almost everyone in this situation. Well, thank you for a very interesting interview, and this is Rollin Kearns terminating the interview with Mr. Bernard McClune on May 10th, 1972. This is Rollin Kearns interviewing Mr. Walter E. Freiberger, who is in the general insurance business in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And he has been a long-time resident. I will let him take it from here and tell you when he came and all about his experiences here. Mr. Freiberger.
I arrived in Bartlesville in 1907, the day before statehood. I moved here with my family from the state of Wisconsin. I well remember and fixed the date in my mind because on that night there was a shooting in a local tavern in which a United States Marshal killed some other people. And I really thought that I had moved to the Wild West. My parents rented a house which was located on the area that is now occupied by the Price Tower, well-known building in our community. My dad immediately proceeded to build a dwelling and home for us on what was then the outskirts of Bartlesville at 5th and Wyandotte. At that time, they were using brick in street paving and sidewalks. And we had a local brick plant manufacturing bricks with the imprint on it, Bartlesville Indian Territory. Many of those bricks are still in that same sidewalk around the old home place. All except two that I know were removed by our son, Jim, and taken to California and now appear in his sidewalk. There were no bridges at the ends of the streets over the Caney River, 7th Street and Cherokee Avenue. We had to ford the river to get across. Later on, the first bridge, known as the Wagon Bridge, was built over Cherokee Avenue, and a dam put in there impounding the water for city use. On the other side of the river, Colonel Jacob Bartles had already started the first town of Bartlesville, which was approximately in 1890. And he built a large mill in which grain, corn was ground, a residence, and a mercantile building. But after that time, we had two other men come to our community that thought that the town should be built on this side of the river. And so Mr. George B. Keeler and William Johnstone started the town on this side and opened a mercantile establishment, general merchandise. When I first came here, they were just finishing up the building of the Bartlesville Interurban Railway, which ran from Bartlesville to Dewey and also connected to what we knew then as Smelter Town, where because of the large supply of cheap gas, we had 3 zinc smelters. Bartlesville Zinc Company, and National Zinc Company, and the Lansing Star. There is only one remaining now, the National Zinc Company.
I attended Bartlesville, the Garfield School, which was very near where we lived. That building, I was informed, had been built by subscription rather than tax money, and is still standing and has been expanded since then. Just south of the school area was a high wire fence which protected the William Johnstone farm, but the youngsters at recess time would crawl into the farm and steal apples out of Mr. Johnstone's orchard. When he first arrived, my brother was employed by the Bartlesville News, one of the early newspapers, which was later absorbed by the Bartlesville Enterprise. My father was interested in oil and mercantile business at Nelogany, but he moved the family to Bartlesville due to the fact that they had no schools at that time at Nelogany. In those days, we enjoyed hunting and fishing in that area and this area, lots of game and lots of fish. That has changed somewhat. The main business area in Bartlesville at the time I arrived was at 2nd and Johnstone, where the most outstanding building was the Almeida Hotel, and also located in the same building, the First National Bank. We also had the Walcott Grocery and the Baird Mercantile, Camel's Drugstore, Hop's Jewelry Store, and various other ones in that area. The first theater in Bartlesville was located upstairs over the Bradley and Bryant building at 2nd, at Dewey Avenue and what used to be known as 3rd Street. They also added about that time 2 outdoor theaters, the Air Dome at 4th and Dewey, and the overhead outdoor theater in the Gray building at 4th and Johnstone. Our first fire department was quartered at 4th and Dewey in a tar paper and frame building, of course, horse-drawn equipment. Our first hospital was located at 13th and Keeler Avenue, and our present-day Civic Center building was finished and dedicated in the year of 1923. During my high school days, I was employed by the old Waukesha Grocery and Meat Market and Ice Cream Plant. During college days, I was employed by the Bartlesville National Bank, which was largely owned and controlled by Mr. Frank Phillips and L.E. Phillips, the organizer of the Phillips Petroleum Company. In fact, during my employment there, I remember that they disposed of their holdings, oil holdings in the north part of this county, and organized the present Phillips Petroleum Company. Incidentally, the church in which we're taking this interview was first organized in 1905 and had its first meetings in the Bradley and Bryant building in that theater area. Mr. Ralph J. Lamb was our first pastor, and I guess I am one of the few that have known all 10 of the senior ministers that have served this church. I am a 50-year member of the American Legion, and Bartlesville Lions Club, and local Masonic bodies. I have enjoyed many fine years in this community, and the community has been good to me. And I have seen many other changes and improvements that have occurred throughout this period.
Mr. Freiberger, we discussed fires just a little bit before we went on the tape. Would you mind reminiscing just a moment on which buildings might have been destroyed by fire during these last 50, 60 years?
Well, inasmuch as I have been in the insurance business, including fire insurance, for the last 46 years, I have naturally known of all of the occurrences of any importance. About the only one that probably worth mentioning now was the fire in the what was known as the Wilhite building, which is occupied by the Masonic Temple on the top floor, which was completely destroyed during a Christmas season one year. I can't remember exactly when, a number of years ago.
Well, thank you very much for a most interesting interview, and this is Roland Kearns terminating the interview with Mr. Freiberger on May 10th, 1972. This is Roland Kearns introducing Mr. George W. Perkins at Bartlesville, Oklahoma on May 10th, 1972. Mr. Perkins was born near Bartlesville quite a few years ago, and I will let you, in his own words, tell you when he was born and all the interesting things that have happened since that time. Mr. Perkins.
My folks came here from Lynn County, Missouri, 1885. My father was born in 1850, and my mother was born in 1865. When they come here in my covered wagon, they had two boys, Frank, 3 years old, Albert, 6 months old. They landed in Bartlesville in the summer of 1885, and the first job that my father had was cutting walnut logs for Jake Bartles in 1885. He also worked with a very known character known as Pistol Pete Eaton, which I brought up there to the Old Settlers Reunion twice from Perkins, Oklahoma. And he also brought his guns with him. He had 2 guns. He was a United States Marshal, they say, when he was 17. And I asked Pistol, I said, he had a brother lived down here at Silver Lake, Frank Eaton, and he got him out of the shoebox, showed him to me in my store there, and I looked them over. I think it was 45. Anyhow, they looked that larger than that to me. And I looked at one of them, I counted up the notches on them. There's 11 on them. And he handed me the other one. I counted up on it, and there's 11 on it. And I said, what's all those marks on there, Pistol? He had a walrus mustache, and he was born in 1860. And he said, well, the other fellow just underestimated himself 22 times. That's what it means. Well, and 1886, my father moved over on Neelogany Creek. And there, in 1893, I was born. And my sister, Mrs. Pearl E. Green, A.W. Green's wife, with city service as the taxman for the state of Oklahoma. She was born, and my sister was born in 1895. She's still living, and my brother Frank died in Los Angeles in 1848. My brother Albert is still living, 87 years old, and but quite feeble. We left the farm and ranch on Neelogany Creek in 1897, moved to Bartlesville. The big noise then, they were going to drill an oil well here. And they did. This equipment was brought in from Red Fork, Oklahoma, in 1897. I believe, in the wintertime, I believe it was January or February, and I think the well was finished in April. Broom and McBride were the contractors. In those days, on the shifts, there was 12 hours. We and when we moved to town, we bought out a restaurant, a revolving bakery, a little grocery store, and on North Delaware, just across the street from Johnson Keeler store, which they put in there in 1884. We run this restaurant, and when the Santa Fe came in here in '98, and the depot was being put over on this side of the river, why, Billy Johnson give a lot free, all of them around close, well, from Osage, or from Dewey to Keeler. And we was one of the first to move our building up on 2nd Street, which is now the drive-in of the Union National Bank. And the other party that moved the building up there the same year, the Spool and the Horse, of course, was John and Jim Gray, which was located now where the RCA is, across the street from the courthouse. And we stayed in business there till 1901. Then we moved down Rock Creek, which is what, 2 or 3 miles below Willow Rock Lodge, and ranched and farmed there till the first of 1905. And we moved to town and bought a home at 2nd and Osage. And my brother and I was 12 and he was 19, going out a recreation party, 5 tables in the Gooseneck Fountain. I got the place cost $750. I furnished my part of the money by raising watermelons on Rock Creek. 1903 and 4, 1903 was a very dry year. I had a horse and a sled, a couple of barrels, and Dad probably fixed me. And I watered these plants through the summer. And in those days, there was a very few that raised watermelons on account of that drought. So we bought them to Bartlesville and sold them. The top prices was 25 cents. Fed the little ones to the hogs. And brought some muskmelons in those days. There was no cantaloupe, it was muskmelon. And in 1899, Sonny Jim Bryant and Bob Bradley had J.D. Mooney build him a building next to us, General Mercantile Store. And right across the street, Joseph P. Grovereau of Coffeyville put in a harness shop. And after he passed away, his son, Paul Grovereau, took over the business. So we stayed there on 2nd Street about 2 years. We moved into the Right Away Hotel, where the May Brothers is now, in 1907. There we had 2 pool tables, or pocket billiard tables, and sometimes we'd stay open all night. Them days were the good old days, the drummers and everything, and stay up and play pool all night. And then, in 1909, when they moved the Right Away Hotel out, both cut it in 2, and they're located on Delaware and First and Osage. We bought out Tony Vanderhill, a cigar store, and newsstand, which was in the Oakland Theater, which was built in 1907 and opened up that year in September. The first show there was Pocahontas. They had 3 floors and what they call in those days, colored people's place upstairs, the 3rd floor. They had 8 boxes for the big boys and girls. And of course, this show, my mother and father went to that show. It was named Pocahontas. And they set up in what's called Buzzard Roost, the last balcony, $5 a seat. The bottom floor was 10, and the second floor was 7.5, and for the boxes it was 15. So as kind of that building was built J.L. Overleaf and run by Dad Flynn. So in 1919 or 18, when the war ended, I worked for city service in the stock room. My wife and sister run the store, and in 1918, my brother and I, Albert, bought out the Shamrock Village Parlor, which is located now where Hearns is. The man that owned it at that time was John Taylor, a Cherokee. We stayed there till 1927, and we sold out to Mr. Lee I. Lynn, Mr. Dixon. Then I went in business. I worked for Dave Mullen Insurance Company a year. Then I went in business where Stewart's Insurance Company is next to Swing, and and I stayed in there for 1936, and I bought Arthur Doherty out, who was running a newsstand in the Gray Brothers building, which is burnt down, and the lot is still vacant. And I stayed in there till 1966, I believe, when the fire destroyed the 6 businesses and the rooming house upstairs. But fortunately, it happened in the wintertime, and at that time, the hotel, the rooming house upstairs had closed down, so there was no loss of life. And I had sporting goods in there with Connection magazine. I had the retail and wholesale of Bartlesville, and I sold a lot of shells, fishing tackle, and I had about 60,000 rounds of ammunition that went off, and some of those shells flew over to the city service building. I was I was interested in fishing, hunting very much, and I was elected president of the Bartlesville Gun Club, the largest hunting club in the state of Oklahoma, 121 members at one time. I was elected president of that club, no salary, for 33 straight years. Charlie Pennell, the first president, and we had Glenn Skinner, another man, as president. Mr. Civils was another president, and I get this other name. And Mr. Puckett, running the hotel, was another president. Well, they got me in there, and I guess